Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is how European settlement happened in the Middle Colonies and the Deep South, Part 1, just about the Middle Colonies, which if you look at your color coding here, you'll see the Middle Colonies are the ones that are in between the Chesapeake Bay colonies and the New England colonies, the modern states of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, even throwing Delaware into that if you want to. The Mid-Atlantic colonies were some of the ones that would end up being a little more liberal and, frankly, quite a bit more extravagant and cultural than either the Chesapeake Bay colonies or the New England colonies. The first colony we want to talk about is New York. So why do I have a map of Europe with the Netherlands being highlighted right here? Well, first of all, let's understand this. Some people refer to this as Holland. Technically, it's the Netherlands, and people from there are called Dutch. I know it's all very confusing. But the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch, had gained their independence from Spain with the help of Spain's primary rival, England. Remember going back to those things about Queen Elizabeth and the rivalry between England and Spain? Well, like I said, the Dutch had actually gained their independence from Spain with England's help. And then they challenged the English. Thanks for helping us out. Now we're going to attack you. These became known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, Anglo meaning English, and Dutch meaning, the Netherlands, Holland. These became known again as the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 1600s, and there were three of them. Now, as a result of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Dutch were able to establish themselves in the world. Soon, they had become a major commercial, naval, and colonial power. The Dutch actually had control of some pretty prominent parts of the world at that time. The first one was the Dutch East Indies. Now, there the Dutch maintained a huge, profitable empire for 300 years. The Dutch East India Company, the settlement company, had roughly 10,000 men and 190 ships. But they also had territory over here. Remember, Columbus had thought that this was India, so these were known as the West Indies, and the Dutch had control of them as well for a while. This was nowhere near as successful. It wasn't because the Dutch didn't know how to have an empire. They were very successful with the Dutch East India Company. But in the West Indies, which you see a modern-day picture of here, the Dutch were often more interested in being pirates rather than businessmen and traders. They maintained a profit in the Caribbean, but it was nowhere near as successful as the East Indies, and they often maintained their profits by relatively illegal means. This was happening during the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean. So when you go to pirate shows, a lot of those guys were probably Dutch. Okay, anyway, so we know the Dutch were prominent, but we still haven't talked about New York at all, so let's get back to New York for a second. All right, like I said, the Dutch are very successful in exploration and colonization. In 1609, Henry Hudson had sailed into today's Hudson River, which is in New York, looking for a shortcut through the continent. Instead, he decided to stay and lay Dutch claim to the region. Therefore, the New York that we know today was not really New York at all at that time. It had a completely different name. It was known as New Netherland because the Dutch came from the Netherlands. Now, this was in 1623 with New Amsterdam, again a city in the Netherlands, as its main city. The city of New Amsterdam would later come to be known as New York. And the Dutch also bought Manhattan Island from Native Americans during that time. Now, New Amsterdam was a fantastic city, much different than the settlements in New England. Remember, this is only 3 years into the Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth when New Amsterdam got started, and there really weren't any major cities in the Chesapeake Bay region. They were small settlements. New Amsterdam was a flat-out city, and a great city. But it also had aristocratic, harsh rulers who weren't interested in free speech like in Rhode Island or religious toleration like in Rhode Island. They flat out abused Quakers in New Amsterdam. They also really weren't that interested in democracy. If you were among the elite, you were in charge. And they granted something called patroonships, and I want you to underline that in the outline. Patroonships were feudal estates along the Hudson River that were just major land holdings of the elite class that lived in New Amsterdam. Now, the New Amsterdam itself as a city was actually very ethnically diverse, but friction was starting to develop with the surrounding Native American tribes. And therefore, as you notice here, there was a wall built in New Amsterdam to protect the citizens of the city from Native American attacks. If you look, you can barely see this wall right there. Now, why do I bring that up? Because that site today, where the wall used to exist, as you can see in this diagram, is today known as Wall Street in modern New York City. So how did this transition take place where they switched from New Amsterdam to New York? Well, that took place in 1664 when the English took over the region. The King of England decided to give it to his brother, the Duke of York, and therefore a new name was born. But we certainly don't want to forget the Dutch influence in the area and thank them for the things that their culture brought to us and made eventually a part of American culture. Things such as Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, bowling, sledding. Look how much fun this looks. Although this guy doesn't look like he's having quite as much fun. Thanks, Dutch people. And skating. Okay, that tells us about New York, but what about Pennsylvania? Well, Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers in 1681. The Quakers were, and still are to this day, also known as the Religious Society of Friends. So if you ever hear that term, you're talking about the Quakers. But why were they called Quakers in the first place? Well, the idea was that they often shook when in religious emotion. They got so passionate about God that they would start to quake. And the Quakers were the religious group back then that would often speak in lots of these and thous and things like that. Now, the Quakers, no matter where they went, were particularly odd in the eyes of a lot of people, primarily because of the shaking, quaking thing when they were involved in religious belief. As a result, no matter where they went, Quakers were often fined or flogged, or in some cases imprisoned for their beliefs. Some of them even died while in prison. So the Quakers were heavily persecuted throughout the colonies wherever they went. Now, this is really too bad because the Quakers were peaceful people. They were very simple, they were very devoted to God, and they were very democratic. Now, if they had one flaw, it was sometimes they were also often very stubborn. But beyond that, there really wasn't any reason to, kill Quakers off just because of their religious beliefs. One of the more interesting things about the Quakers is that they had no clergy. They would simply speak up in church and lead themselves. It was a very group-oriented communal thing. When you felt like leading the congregation, you just stood up and led the congregation. The Quakers were also decidedly against conflict, and anytime the option of military service came up, well, they would refuse it. Now, they wouldn't have out-and-out protests. They were peaceful, so they would refuse military service in a very passive way. Eventually, Pennsylvania would become the most ethnically diverse colony because of its liberal attitude toward a lot of things and peaceful attitude toward a lot of things. So where does Pennsylvania get its name? Well, it's from this guy right here, William Penn. The founder of Pennsylvania, Penn was not originally a Quaker. He actually started showing interest in it at the age of 16, and his dad was so angry at him for being involved or interested in Quakerism that his father flogged him for it. As a young man, Penn was an English soldier, but he wanted to go to the New World to escape the persecution of Quakers, even the punishments of his father. Eventually, his father passed away, and it was discovered that the English government still owed Penn's father a huge debt. So, as payment, young William got what is now Pennsylvania. The name means Penn's woodland, or Penn's woods. This was as a result of the debts that England still owed his dad, and so essentially Pennsylvania became William Penn's inheritance from his father, who didn't like Quakers at all. Now, while Penn was a pretty good guy and should be celebrated for his accomplishments, he was very underappreciated and had a very rough end to his life. He suffered a stroke and ended up in massive debt, being virtually penniless. But of course, his colony and eventually state lives on in his name. So, what was Pennsylvania like? Well, as you can imagine, it was probably more similar to Rhode Island than it was to Massachusetts Bay. Pennsylvania was very open-minded in its policies, although blue laws preventing alcohol did exist there. They recruited settlers and welcomed squatters who were already there, squatters being people who lived in a region that was not permanently settled yet. When they did decide to settle the region, they simply said to the squatters, well, you were already here anyway, so you can stay. They also formed the city of Philadelphia, which is a Greek word that means brotherly love. And today the city of Philadelphia is still known as the city of brotherly love. And they had a very peaceful relationship with Native Americans until others moved in. Freedom of worship and open land policies would also be appealing to settlers, but with the blue laws preventing alcohol in place. Now that leaves just Delaware and New Jersey, but their stories aren't really all that unique unless you're from Delaware and New Jersey. Delaware was originally founded as New Sweden down here in 1638. Also note Lord Delaware from the old Jamestown days. Well, that's who Delaware is named after. New Jersey was formed in a very similar fashion to New York. The Duke of York, remember his brother had given him New Netherland and renamed it New York? Well, the Duke of York basically just sold New Jersey to two businessmen in 1664, and they were the ones who decided to call it New Jersey after a town back in England. Wish it was a better story than that, but that's basically it. And that is how the Mid-Atlantic colonies were settled. Thanks for listening.